Good morning, good Friday morning, everyone, and welcome to the Practical SQL Server HADR show. I am coming to you live in the most controversial city in North America at the moment. Yes, we have sun outside, but we also have like 12, I think 10 to 12 inches of snow dumped over us, over the whole night. And so after this, I'm actually going to go out and start shoveling my driveway. Anyway, welcome to this week's topic. If you're new, if you're joining in new, please say hi. If you're joining in either from LinkedIn or YouTube or Twitter, say hi, type hi in the comment section. And welcome. Let me put in a banner real quick. There we are. And I started doing this earlier this year where I talk about topics pertaining to SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and I'm a Microsoft Certified Master specializing in SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery. This was actually a topic from last week. In fact, there were about 5 or 6 questions in the queue. But because I covered so much on answering the first question, I didn't get to cover a lot. And this is very, very relevant, especially if you're looking at upgrading your SQL Server instances. Like this year is going to be the end of mainstream support for SQL Server 2017. In fact, I was talking to a customer the other day, and they are now looking at upgrading SQL Server 2019 just because of the mainstream support. If you're still on SQL Server 2005, I don't know why, but again, the reality is there are still people out there, customers out there, who are running legacy applications that it is very difficult to upgrade to the latest and the greatest, even moving to the cloud. This reminds me of applications like healthcare applications or pharmaceutical applications that need to be certified. But in order for them to be certified, or in order for them to upgrade, they need to recertify, and it's a ton of work. That's why it is, and I can understand that, it is challenging to simply upgrade for the sake of upgrading and not consider a lot of the things that go on with the upgrade. For most people out there, for most companies, most organizations, pretty straightforward. You just upgrade, but it's all about the amount of work, the amount of investment that you have to put in when you're upgrading or migrating in this case, because I kind of look at migrating and upgrading kind of like the same, because even if you're just looking at migrating from one hardware to another hardware, from hardware to virtual machine, from virtual machine to cloud, one platform to another, and I'm not talking about operating system and SQL Server, we're keeping everything the same except for hardware to virtual, from VM to cloud. If you're keeping everything the same and you're simply migrating, you're still going to have to do your tests. You're not going to be doing your application functionality or application regression testing, but you're still going to have to test. But if you're doing both, migrating and upgrading at the same time, it is going to take a lot of work. And most people are not willing to make that investment, especially with the frequency of releases that Microsoft has been doing for the past couple of years. I mean, going back to the previous versions, man, I'm dating myself here. SQL Server 6.5 to SQL Server 7, that was a couple of years. SQL Server 7 to SQL Server 2000, another couple of years. SQL Server 2000 to 2005, you could see that when we started using years as version numbers, so that's a 5-year gap. So if you decide, hey, I want to go to the latest and the greatest, you had like a 5-year window. Of course, back then, Microsoft did not announce in SQL Server 2000 days or in 2000 that they were going to release SQL Server 2005, 5 years later. But part of that is really planning and making sure that you're making the most out of your investments, not just when it comes to software licensing. Keep in mind, when you're building your apps on database versions, specific versions, you're putting in a lot of your manpower, your effort, your human resources, your time, not just licensing and hardware. Most people just think about the licensing and the hardware costs, but the overall maintenance of your infrastructure throughout the life cycle. And then you're going to do that again, the next release. And from 2005 to 2008, that's a 3-year cycle. And then you have like 2008 to 2008 R2. That's barely 2 years. And then you got 2012. So the release cycle has become shorter and shorter to a point where customers are now skipping versions. From 2000, people would jump all the way to 2008 R2. From 2005, now people are jumping to 2014 because it doesn't make practical sense to just upgrade for the sake of upgrading. Now, of course, it's different from other industries where they're that is what they do, like software vendors. I'm thinking of something else. If you're a software vendor, you need to constantly test your applications on certain versions of SQL Server to cover supportability. And the reason I'm talking about all of these and the reason I'm covering all of these is because while Microsoft is really pushing customers to migrate to the next version or even the latest version, in fact, they're giving you a ton of incentives to move to the next version. But you also have to count the cost. Part of that cost is the continuous operation and maintenance cost throughout its life cycle. So don't just get stuck on thinking about, oh, we have to think about licensing, because that's always the conversation. In fact, the customer that I was talking to last week or earlier this week, we were already looking at differences in pricing when it comes to standard versus enterprise, per core, per cal, what are the requirements, and not realizing that that's just the beginning of the calculation of the total cost. We are so fixated on, am I doing enterprise? Am I doing standard? Am I doing per cal or per core? In fact, when SQL Server 2019 announced that they were introducing transparent data encryption in standard edition, customers were like, sure, why don't we do a SQL Server 2019, and then we can take advantage of the transparent data encryption. But again, people are just looking at one aspect of the cost calculation or the investment. That's part of migration and upgrade, but don't just look at that as the total cost. What are you going to use it within the next 5 to 10 years? Even if you're thinking, hey, we're only going to be keeping 2019 for 4 or 5 years, because by the time 2025, I don't know when the next version after 2022 is going to get released. But what are you going to be doing throughout that? Are you just going to be using newer versions just for the sake of being in under mainstream support, or are you going to take advantage of some of the features that were introduced? And these are some of the things that you have to consider as part of your planning process. So again, enough of that, and I will go into some of the questions that I did not get to answer. And if you're watching this, there's a form below, a link to a form below where you can submit your questions way ahead of time so I can answer them live. The thing about this is I kind of had themes per week, and this was the theme from last week, which spilled over to this week. And there's also an option on the form where you can pick the theme, so you can submit your questions based on what specific theme I have for that week, or even previous weeks, because I'm going to cycle all of these based on the questions that I get. Anyway, first question, and this is pretty common nowadays. How do I migrate from a 3-node Windows Server 2019 failover cluster with 3 replica availability group to the cloud? And I'm guessing this is either AWS or Azure. So the setup goes, or the context goes, they have a 3-node Windows Server 2019 failover cluster. They are running 3 replica availability groups. I'm guessing 2 nodes are for high availability and 1 node is for disaster recovery. I mean, same thing. Maybe 2 replicas are synchronous commit and automatic failover, and the other node, or rather replica, is async commit and manual failover. And they want to move from, I'm guessing, on-premises, possibly VMs, on-premises, and moving to the cloud. Now, this is a pretty common thing that I've been seeing. In fact, one of my very first customers, this was a couple of years ago in the SQL Server 2016 days, and this is kind of similar to their setup, but in their case, they're more uh, on the HA side, and they were using, I think, a third-party tool for DR. But in this case, and like I said, I'm just giving you some context as to environments like this. For one, they're still relatively new as far as their infrastructure is concerned, given that they're running Windows Server 2019 failover cluster. That's relatively new. Number two, they're still pretty new, or well, I wouldn't want to consider this relatively new, given that SQL Server 2017 mainstream support would end in July. I think July. Let me double check. July of this year. Yes. So the moving to the cloud would give them a couple of different options. And the way I'm thinking about this, or rather the way other people are thinking about this, is a simple lift and shift. And a lift and shift is simply taking what you currently have, taking lift and moving it to whatever platform, whether it's in a colo, a cloud service provider, public cloud like AWS or Azure. And the one thing that I see people, well, first of all, let's stop and take a look at the other things that you have to consider. First and foremost, this has some risks associated with it. For one, you're giving away freedom and flexibility on some of the things that you were able to do on premises versus what you can do on the cloud. For some DBAs, some sysadmins, they're okay with that because at the end of the day, when they're running on VMs, it was their VM admins taking care of the underlying platform. Here, it's going to be the vendor. Whether it's AWS or Azure, they're going to be taking care of that. All you're simply accessing is the underlying VM and OS, right? The VM platform, well, we don't have access to that. Second, it is going to be a little bit of a stretch because the way things work on premises are not exactly the way things work on the cloud. So there's risks associated with this. Are you going to be putting your applications on the cloud? That's part of the considerations. I worked with a client a couple of years ago where they kind of did not consider putting their applications on the cloud. So when they were testing initially and they were ready to cut over to their cloud infrastructure, all of a sudden they felt like, hey, how come this is very slow? And then they realized that their applications are on premises, but their databases are on the cloud. Bad idea. And so this is part of the consideration. There's risks associated with this. What happens when your cloud provider becomes unavailable? Of course, this is no different from what happens when your underlying VM platform or physical hardware on premises becomes unavailable. It's going to be the job of your VM admins, your hardware admins. Same thing. Again, you're simply giving away a lot of that freedom to your cloud provider and letting them take care of that. So that's the first one. What are your goals? It is important because in my case, I keep hearing customers moving to the cloud because it is our directive. We need to do it this year. Another client that I was talking to the other day said they have been planning to move to the cloud within the next 2 years. Planning is different from execution, and you could plan all you want. You can talk about it. You can do a SWOT analysis, as what most business people would talk about, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You can talk about that all day long. You could do a pros and cons. You could do anything. But until you do, and that's one of the big reasons why I'm a big fan of taking action, because that's the only way that you are going to get results. In their case, they have been planning, quote unquote, planning for years. I think this is our second year planning, and they haven't done anything yet. So what are your goals? Is it just because somebody from upper management decided, hey, we're going to move to the cloud? Because there should be a compelling reason to move to the cloud. I'm not saying you don't, I'm just saying be clear. Be very, very clear about the reasons why you want to move to the cloud. It is, it's kind of like shooting for, let's just move to the cloud and get away with this. No, you have to plan, you have to take stock of the cost, because most people think that moving to the cloud is going to be cost effective until they start seeing the monthly bill, right? Because, well, you're not paying for hardware, you're not paying for electricity, you're not paying for data center manpower resources, you're not paying for data center resources, you're just paying the cloud provider. And so, again, this is one of the reasons why in the beginning I said when you're planning for an upgrade or a migration process, you don't just look at the initial cost. And I know at the back of your mind, you're thinking, wait a second, I'm a DBA, I'm a sysadmin, I don't really care about the cost calculations. That's the job of the CFO or the bean counters. No, you are going to be taking care of data and digital resources or technology resources or IT assets. And back in the days when all we need to care about is taking care of them, you have got to count the cost, right? If you're a driver and you're driving someone else's car, you don't just ignore the fact that, hey, if something goes wrong, you need to fix it. I'll just give the bill to my boss. No, you have to think about, how do I keep this car running smoothly and not have to worry about constant uh, maintenance costs? Because every time, especially if you're driving Uber, for instance, every time you're not driving, you're not making money. And so in this case, for the underlying platform, and I know I'm taking a lot of time talking about this because this is really important. It's not enough for upper management to give you some mandates or just put on lay down some mandates about moving to the cloud without everybody getting clear on what the real goal is. And quite frankly, though, I've seen so many customer environments where they just move to the cloud, but they don't have an end goal. So this is actually a very expensive thing if you start to think about it. You do a lift and shift when you think about it. Well, I don't have to worry about licenses. I'm just going to bring my own licenses. I've already paid for them for on-premises deployment. I'm just going to bring them there. But this is just one of the many things that you have to worry about when it comes to cost calculations. So again, be very, very clear about the goals for why your company, your boss, your organization wants to move to the cloud. Where was I? Three. The third thing that you have to consider are responsibilities. In an on-premise setting, if your underlying VM isn't working, so let's say you decide you want to build a SQL Server always on availability group on top of a failover cluster, and your failover cluster is not working, you can always pick up the phone and call whoever's responsible for it. If something went wrong with the hardware, you call the people at the data center, and they're going to go ahead and fix it. You kind of have an understanding of who's responsible for what. In a cloud environment, can you actually unplug network cables? Well, no, you can't, because your networking is virtualized. It's networking as a service as well. So it is a little bit challenging, and it is also important for you to understand whose role is what and what responsibilities are associated with it. Okay. What is your responsibility as a DBA or a sysadmin even, when you're moving from on-premises to the cloud, like in this particular case, a 3-node Windows Server failover cluster? Who is responsible for building the failover cluster on the cloud? Because, well, for one, you could always spin up, I'm just going to refer to Azure here. Pick the VM size, pick the operating system version, the SQL Server version with a corresponding CU, whatever version you have on premises, pick that, and then move forward with it. Is that according to your internal best practices? Is that according to how you want your failover cluster deployed for your SQL Server availability groups? What about taking care of the things that are on like settings on the networking side? Who is responsible for that? you will be spending a ton of time worrying about networking on the cloud, even when you're a DBA. And that's one of the reasons why you have to be very, very comfortable with networking. You don't have to be a CCIE or a CCNE or Cisco certified, whatever, in order for you to do this. You just have to have a good foundation of networking so that when something goes wrong, you don't pull. I don't have any hairs to pull. You don't pull your hair trying to figure out what the real problem is. And understanding these differences in responsibilities can help you succeed, because moving it is one thing. As I mentioned in the beginning, you would have to worry about the normal operations, the care, the feeding, administration and maintenance operations all throughout its life cycle. So if you're not comfortable with how the cloud works, or if you've not even explored the cloud yet, this is something that you have to push back on, because the last thing you want is to be responsible for something and you're not even ready to take over. A lot of people would assume, oh, I'm pretty good with the on-premises stuff, I can move to the cloud. You really have to be familiar with how that particular cloud platform works, specifically their networking. Specifically, their networking. So responsibilities of who is responsible for what, the responsibilities of the different people on the team. Would you be having a cloud admin or a cloud person, or is it going to be you all throughout? Okay. Also, what features will be available when you start moving to the cloud? And you might be thinking, wait a second, if I'm just moving the same version of SQL Server and the same version of Windows, kind of like a lift and shift, should I not be expecting the same features between on-premises, and since they're the same versions, right? Keep in mind that there are some features that can be leveraged on the cloud. I'll give you an example here. Cloud Witness. I'm not a big fan of using Cloud Witness when all of your cluster nodes are in the same data center, uh, or on premises. Why? Because all of your cluster nodes are on the same data center and you have a witness somewhere. Not because I don't trust the cloud, it's just because of the fact that you are exposing your mission critical databases to the internet. And for me, it's not just about high availability, it's also about security. It's also about performance. I call it the spa of taking care of databases: the security, performance, and availability. But again, in that case, there's I don't want to say there's no point, but it's not practical to have, in this specific case, it's not practical to have a cloud witness. But now you're moving to the cloud. Now you can start taking advantage of that. For one, all of your assets are now on the cloud. So it does make sense for you to have a cloud witness. In the case of, let's say, you have an on-premises deployment with 3-node failover cluster, and you have a file share witness, that is a cost saving in and of itself. You're removing one VM. Some people would say, I'll just host the file share witness on my domain controller. That's just for demo purposes. You don't do that in production. So you can take advantage of the fact that you no longer need a dedicated VM, a highly available file share for that. Just put that on a cloud as your witness. So that's one of the features that you have to keep in mind. And that is for you to take a look at, take stock of what version, what features are available on premises that you can take to the cloud, or that you can take advantage when you're on the cloud. Okay. It is also important to do risk mitigation. There was a client that I talked to last year. He does not have any background at all with Azure. This is the very first time. He's been a DBA for like a decade or so, and he does not have any background with Azure, but he was given the mandate to move. By the way, this is not his question, and this is not his environment. Uh, now I'm thinking about it. He was given a mandate to move their 2-node Windows Server failover cluster to Azure. And one of the things that he did in order to accomplish that was to add a new replica. So there's a third replica on Azure, and he just allowed the databases to get replicated as part of the data synchronization process. When the time came to cut over, he couldn't bring the availability group online on Azure. I can't remember the details of which. He couldn't, and it took them 16 hours to bring everything online. And this is part of your risk mitigation. And mind you, of course, if you're a huge organization and 4 hours of maintenance or 4 hours of outage is the only allowable recovery time objective that you can handle, and you're down for 16 hours, you're going to be in big trouble. And guess who's going to get the blame for it? You. And this is one of the reasons why I said it's not enough for you to take on the challenge and say, hey, I'm going to do it. No big deal, right? It is important for you to take stock of what risks are you going to be taking on. Because when you're dealing with a high availability solution, we're trying to mitigate those risks. There's a reason why your databases are in the high availability solution, like always on availability groups or failover clustering. You want high availability. And if you're not mitigating those risks as part of a lift and shift, if you're not mitigating those risks as part of migrating from on-premises to the cloud, when something goes wrong, how are you going to roll back? And this is huge because, again, you could spend all the time, money, and resources trying to plan all of these things, but not include a risk mitigation plan and rollback strategy. You are shooting yourself in the foot. And this is actually one of the reasons why he reached out to me. He cannot afford the stress, the anxiety of going through that experience again. He did everything that he needed to do. Again, with no background on Azure, he tried and configured everything, added the replica on Azure because the documentation says you can. He cut over to Azure, couldn't bring the AG online, spent a couple of times, and he decided after 8 hours can't do it, moved back, another 8 hours got wasted. So that's a total of 16-hour outage. And now he's even afraid. It becomes I want to say it becomes a traumatic experience, especially if you're the only person in charge of this and you're dealing with massively large infrastructures and it's a mission critical database, and all of these things start to compile and really give you a very, very bad experience. So how do I migrate? First, count the cost. Count the cost. Let me go back there. Count the cost. There's a risk. There's the cost associated, not just from the licensing, the VM cost, and throughout the life cycle. Count that. Do the math. Right? Do the math. How much will it take? And the good thing about this is that the cloud vendors are giving you some ideas on how much is this going to be per minute, per second, depending on the size of the VM, the transactions in and out. And of course, you're also going to be looking at data transfer. If your client applications are on premises, or in the case of moving it to the cloud, data going to is going to be free. Data going out, you're going to have to pay for that. It's one of the reasons why it doesn't make sense for you to just move your databases to the cloud and not take your applications with it, because you're going to be paying for the network latency. Doesn't matter if you have a very huge pipe connectivity between on-premises and the cloud, you're still going to be paying for the data going out. Every cloud provider does that. Count the cost, right? Second, define the goal. What is your ultimate goal? Is it because you want to move to the cloud to save money? Really? That's why I said in the first thing is count the cost. That way you can get a sense of, are you really saving money? Right? Count the cost. And don't just count the cost in terms of hardware cost, or in this case, compute cost, storage cost, licensing cost throughout the entire life cycle of the asset. Okay? In this case, it's a SQL Server always on availability group. And in this case, multiply by 3. If you're looking at a 3 replica AG, include the cost to get you trained. Don't be like that person who decided, yeah, I'm going to do this on my own, and then at the end of the day, he got traumatized for taking the database offline for 16 hours. Don't be like that guy. Get training. That is very, very important. To count the cost, be clear on the goal, uh, define the responsibilities, like whose responsibility is what. Do you have a cloud admin? Do you have somebody who specializes in networking on the cloud? Because that's part of it. Okay. Um, Understand and look at the versions that you're currently running on and where you want to migrate to and what features you can take advantage of. Like I said, this even if you're moving to the same version of SQL Server and the same version of Windows, there are things that you can do on the cloud that you cannot do on premises. That's one. And part of this is also understanding some old habits that you have to let go of and embracing new habits. Sure, compute, storage, and networking are practically the same concepts. I'm talking about concepts, not implementation. Compute, storage, and networking are the same concepts, but who's responsible for what? How are we going to do it? And can we take our best practices from on-premises to the cloud and just do whatever we want with it? Part of that is really human behavior of doing things the same way, moving from on-premises to the cloud. And this is actually a good example of that. What else? Mitigate risks. Mitigate risks. You have to count the cost and mitigate risks, which includes having a rollback strategy. And to sum this all up, okay, when one of my clients did this, I said, so what do you really need the availability group for? And they only needed the AG because when they started counting the cost, it got them to a dollar value that is 3 times more expensive than what they have on premises, which then negates all the efforts that they are putting into moving to the cloud because their mandate was to go to the cloud to save money. No. And that's why I said, go back to the real reason why. And so when we took a step back and started looking at all of these things, they realized that the only reason they had something like this, a 3 replica AG, by the way, I'm not referring to the person who could ask the question. The only reason why they had this was because they're a software service company, they planned for maintenance so that they can achieve their recovery time objective. They have a very short recovery time objective, I think ranging about 20 to 30 minutes because their clients are all over the world. So a 20 to 30 minute downtime is all they can afford. And so that's the reason. And they broke their databases into multiple availability groups running on multiple replicas at the same time. So it's not like one primary and 2 secondaries, but every single node is a primary replica of the other. And somebody's going to shoot me for this. It's kind of like an active, again, using some of the old jargons that people use. But there is no standby. And when we started to take a step back and look at the real reason why they did that in the first place, that was to achieve the goal. And I said, wait a second. You can achieve this on the cloud without having to do a lift and shift. And we sat down, we wrote down the main goal because that is the main goal. It doesn't matter how you achieve the main goal. And that's one of the reasons I keep emphasizing on being very clear about your goal, because so long as you achieve the goal, you're good. In fact, the design that we came up with was so cost effective, they didn't do a lift and shift. They re-architected everything. Same version of Windows, same version of SQL Server, moved to the cloud, and they were happy because they literally cut down on cost, not triple the cost. When they're doing a lift and shift, they were tripling the cost, but when we re-architected everything to achieve their goal, everything was good. Plus the fact that they have to also take a look at overall operations and maintenance costs with it. Man, that was a long explanation for this. But again, all of these questions are really, I should say, they're an entire project in and of itself. And it doesn't make sense for me to just cover the technical aspects of it, because the more important thing here is the people and the process aspect. Sure, if you're the only person doing this, you're doing a lift and shift, very easy to do, right? But the reality is you are going to have to deal with risks. You are going to deal with responsibilities outside of your scope. You're going to have to be exploring territories you haven't done or you haven't gone before, and that's a little bit scary, especially when your job is online. Like that person who ended up taking the entire database platform for 60. Wow, I don't know how he did it, but that's impressive. Anyway, moving on to question number 2, or I think this is 4, 5, 6. Question number 6, coming from last week's. What are your thoughts about doing a cluster OS rolling upgrade from Windows Server 2012 R2 to Windows Server 2019? We want to replace our hardware and upgrade the OS. I think this is because, and again, I'm making assumptions here based on the environment, based on the question. I think this is because of Windows Server 2016's ability to do cluster rolling upgrades. And let me explain what cluster rolling upgrades, how it works. You have a Windows Server 2012 R2, right? And this is kind of like a N-1 thing, meaning you can't go from 2012 to 2019. It has to be an N-1, meaning if you're moving to 2019, you have to be on 2016. If you want to move to 2016, you have to be on 2012 R2, and so on and so forth. Okay, you can't jump from 2012. Can I call it R1? Yeah, I think you cannot move from upgrade from 2012 Windows Server 2012 R1 to Windows Server 2019. You can't do that. Okay, so the idea behind this is you have an existing failover cluster, let's say Windows Server 2012 R2 in this case, and you're introducing a new node that is running a higher version of Windows, and then you let the cluster database get resynchronized, get updated, and then you fail over the cluster core resources update, and then you start removing all of the nodes. Not a big fan of that, by the way. I'm just explaining how it works. Not a big fan. Anything that has something to do with an in-place upgrade, I am not a big fan. And it's also interesting because when you read a documentation, it explains how it is done. It walks you through the exact process of how it is done. So if you decide, hey, you want to test it out, you want to do it, go figure. Okay. The most common question that I hear from people when it comes to this is it supported? Right? I think the better question, well, first off, there's a risk. As I mentioned in the beginning or a couple of minutes back, I'm not a big fan of anything in place, whether it's upgrading SQL Server in place upgrades, or upgrading Windows Server failover cluster upgrades in place. Not a big fan of that. I think I've only done a few of those, a handful of those in the past, because the customer was really insistent. We want this, we want. And in the days of virtualization, having a reason of, oh, it's going to be very expensive on the hardware. Come on, we're virtualizing this. The risk, any outage, is more expensive than throwing in another machine. Okay, so there's a risk associated with this. The main reason why I'm not a big fan of in-place upgrades, be it for operating system or for SQL Server, is the fact that when something goes wrong, there's no turning back. There's no going back. That is very risky. And if you've been listening to what I've been saying, even from last week, if you haven't watched the recording yet, is there's a reason why you're running your databases on a high availability platform like a Windows Server failover clustering, or an availability group, or a failover clustered instance for SQL Server. You want high availability. And anything that would cause that high availability solution to be offline for an extended period of time, you try to avoid it at all costs. Why? It's not because you're afraid of it. It's because you're trying to mitigate risks. And I've done that a lot in the past, tested it out, and it's one of the reasons why I don't recommend it. Because it's not about the technology, it's about risk mitigation. Sure, it is supported, but it's not about whether or not it's supported, it's whether or not when something goes wrong, are you ready to face the challenges? Okay, risk mitigation. If you can afford not to even have those problems and challenges, good thing. Okay, in fact, I I'm a firm believer of, even though we are tech professionals and we get paid to solve problems, I would rather prevent those problems from happening in the first place. Don't get me wrong, I love solving tech problems. I love solving HA, DR, SQL Server, clustering, availability groups, FCI. I love solving those problems, but if we can prevent them from happening in the first place, that'd be better. So risk mitigation is key. That's first and foremost. That's why for me, it's always a side-by-side migration. Side by side. In fact, when Microsoft introduced distributed availability groups for SQL Server in SQL Server 2016, if you want to move to a different hardware or upgrade to a different version of SQL Server, do distributed AGs. Of course, on the assumption that you're very comfortable with doing that, because there's a lot of moving parts that you have to consider. But that's because in case something went wrong, the other platform remain untouched. Other than the fact that you killed connectivity so that you don't worry about client applications connecting and introducing transactions. But in case something goes wrong, you could always go back to it in less than a few minutes. If you don't panic, because when you do panic, sometimes it takes hours. That's risk mitigation for me. That's why I'm so not a big fan of in-place upgrades. And this is an in-place upgrade. When you're doing cluster rolling updates, cluster OS rolling upgrade, it's an in-place upgrade. I might be thinking, oh, how is that in-place upgrade when you are introducing a new node, a brand new node, and you are starting from scratch for that new node? Sure, some would argue that it's a brand new node, clean slate, brand new installation, freshly installed, clean, what have you. But what happens there is all of your cluster configuration is going to get migrated or copied over to this node's version of the cluster database, meaning every crap that you don't want also gets copied into this. And that's why I said this is not a fresh, clean thing, even though you're introducing a fresh, clean OS, a brand new node, a higher version of Windows. That's not fresh, clean thing. And there's risk to that, because if there's a ton of crap that you don't need and you don't want and it's giving you headaches, and now you can't figure out, hey, which configuration is which, then you're carrying that old baggage with you. I mean, the analogy that I use here when I was doing this in my training class was, if you're moving to a new house and you got a ton of stuff that you don't need, are you going to take that with you, or are you going to get rid of it? Might as well get rid of it. We got a brand new house. The same thing here. You don't want to carry stuff over that is that driver supported on this version. And that's the thing, right? You're carrying over a lot of these configuration settings, and you don't know which one you want, which one you don't want, because the cluster database replication is going to happen regardless. So that's the risk that you have to worry about. So that's one. Okay. Number two, in addition to risk mitigation, is asking the question, is it supported? Sure, if you look at the documentation, it is fully supported. There's a reason why he was asking this question. It is fully supported, start to finish. There's even a document that outlines every single step that you need to do, how you set up, how you do it. So it's fully supported. It's not a question of whether or not it is fully supported. And this is a question that keeps coming up every time with my clients. Hey, is this version of SQL Server supported? Or is this feature supported with this version, with this addition, with this setup? I think the better question that you need to ask is not, is this supported? You already know it is supported if you've seen it in the documentation. You already know that when you pick up the phone and call Microsoft, they're going to help you. They're going to provide you with technical support because it is in the documentation. The better question that you need to ask is, can I support this? Because when something goes wrong, you don't immediately pick up the phone and call Microsoft. You are going to try and fix it yourself first. I couldn't count the number of times when people would start asking questions, especially for more complicated HA scenarios, like um, three replica AG, like in this case, or oh, this one's different. Like the previous question, three replica AG running on three node failover cluster stretched across two different data centers, and they would ask, is this supported? I would give them a white paper saying it is supported, go ahead and do it, but it's really not the question that you should be asking. The question is, number one, can you build it? And number two, can you support it? That is an even more important question that you need to ask yourself. Because even if Microsoft can support it, when something goes wrong, they're not your level 1 support. You are. When something goes wrong, your monitoring tool starts sending email alerts. They're not going to send it to Microsoft. They're going to send it to you. Guess who's going to get the phone calls? Not the Microsoft engineers, you. So a better question that you need to ask yourself is, can I support this? So when you're migrating or upgrading, like in this case, a cluster, sure, doing a cluster OS rolling upgrade is fully supported. Can you support it? Is the question. Okay. And anytime, and I want to speak on behalf of consultants who would come in and start designing applications or infrastructures in the case of availability groups, and they would design this complex architecture where there's a ton of replicas and there's so many nodes, there's many virtual IP. Sure, it looks good on your resume that you built this massively large infrastructure, but before you leave that solution as a consultant, before you leave that to your clients' environments or your customers' environments, you have to ask the question, can they support it? Because most of and it's interesting because the project that I've been working on for the past couple of years, it's kind of similar to this. Some consultants come in, or a lead engineer used to work for this company, built this massively large infrastructure, complex, what have you, latest and greatest, and then they left. No documentation, nobody knows what he did, nobody understood what was going on, and so they can't even support it. It doesn't matter if the design is simple so long as you can support it. So again, a question that you need to constantly ask is not whether or not Microsoft supports this. You have a 2 replica AG, 1 replica is readable. Don't ask the question, is this supported? Ask the question, can I support this? Okay, it's not enough to ask the question, of course, I'm not saying you go ahead and do something that isn't fully supported. That's not what I'm saying here. All I'm saying is, in addition to asking, is this officially supported? Ask yourself, can I support this? Can you support this? Because when this thing goes sideways, you're going to get the phone calls, you're going to get the email alerts, and you're going to be the one fixing it. So even if the cluster OS rolling upgrade is supported, the question is, if that thing goes sideways, and if it's a project and you're cutting short on your deadline, or you've gone past your deadline, are you going to call Microsoft? Or are you going to be fixing this? Oh, and by the way, do you have support included in your contract? That's all part of this. Okay. Another thing here is, I've already explained. Part of that is cluster rolling upgrades is really some variation of an in-place upgrade. There are some configuration settings that you don't want to take with you when you're building a new environment. Okay? When you're building a new environment, you can do whatever you want with it. You can learn from that crappy environment that you didn't want, document everything that you wanted, remove everything that you don't want, and then you can apply that to the new environment. And it's clean, it's freshly installed, it is stable, right? It's one of the reasons why when I'm building a failover cluster or an availability group, and then it's not in production yet, and all of a sudden I had a snag, I fix it. I fix it first, document it, and then do everything again from scratch. Why? Because I don't want that small thing to interfere with how I maintain and manage the infrastructure down the road, or even affect the stability and reliability of the infrastructure. Keep in mind, you have your high availability solutions for a reason. You want highly available infrastructures that are stable, reliable, highly available, fault tolerant, resilient, and you can't achieve that when all that crap is sitting with your existing setup. Okay, um, and again, um, there's always this pushback when you're doing a side-by-side migration. Like I said, the cost, oh, expensive. We have to bring in additional hardware. Again, in the days of virtualization, that's not really the case, because you can provision an overpower. And it's all coordination. You can provision a not so powerful VM just so you can have the VMs available. Once you're ready to cut over, power down the old, and reassign vCPUs and virtual memory to the new VMs. But again, it's coordination. The more important question that you need to ask is not, hey, we're adding new hardware. Is it going to be expensive? The more important question that you need to ask is, which is more expensive, the additional hardware or the risk associated with this? You gotta make that choice. And so, is the hardware more expensive, or is the risk, let's say, especially if this is in a production environment already, is the extra hardware more expensive, or is the risk of being offline for 16 hours? I'm not throwing somebody under the bus. Or is the risk of being offline for 16 hours more expensive? You need to be able to ask those questions. So, again, those are my thoughts. Not a big fan of an in-place upgrade. I'd rather do a side-by-side migration. Don't ever ask the question, is it supported, if you cannot support it. Okay, you have to ask both. Is it officially supported by Microsoft, and can I support it? Kind of like the and logic dependency in a failover cluster. Ask, is this officially supported by Microsoft, and can I support this down the road? And don't just base that question on your skill set. Don't just base that question on your skill set. What do I mean by this? You are going to get some sleep. You're going to go on vacation. You decide, travel after this whole pandemic thing ends. You are going to have a life. You don't want to be carrying your phone, carrying your pager, so that when this thing goes south, of course, it's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. Maybe you're on vacation, some junior sysadmin started messing around with it and then took the entire thing offline. Who are they going to call? If you're the only person on the team, guess who is going to get that phone call? You. And so you have to think about that. It's not just about, is this supported by Microsoft? And can I support this? You have to ask the question, am I the only one who's supposed to support this? Every high availability solution, I always tell my customers, have at least two people, so that when someone needs to go on vacation, they need to go on a family emergency, somebody is there standing by. Okay, it doesn't make sense to have a high availability solution when you don't have people who are highly available. That's where the on-call is for, and that's where the operational support is for, so that when something goes wrong, somebody needs to be available. It doesn't have to be you. That's why part of that is not just, can I support this, but can we support this? And if you're the only person doing this, please be kind to yourself. Get a backup. Okay, get a backup. So those are my thoughts. I think I have time for another one. Last question is this. I have a SQL Server 2012. I'm guessing it's a standalone instance, which I want to migrate to 2019. I also want to create a failover cluster for high availability, but I don't know what I should do first. What you need to do is get training. Because if you're asking questions like this clearly you're putting your company at risk. Keep in mind, the only reason, the way I look at this, the only reason why you want to put your databases in a high availability solution is because you need it. You don't go ahead and buy a plane just so you can look at it, or you can tell the whole world that you know how to fly a plane. Yeah, sometimes you have to have a valid reason why you want to deploy an availability group or a failover clustered instance. You want it to be highly available. And again, I've seen this so many times in the past. And I use the analogy of, I remember the very first time I did my training class, my always on availability training class with Brent Ozer back in 2017. I just broke my right leg. And it is very relevant because I wouldn't want to be going through surgery knowing that the doctor who is going to do the operation is an intern and asking questions like, what do I do first? That is scary. Okay. Because for one, if you don't know what to do first, and this is the thing about following guidelines, step-by-step processes. And I'm guilty of this because I've written a ton of articles on MS SQL tips about this. And it gives people a false sense of security. Yeah, I've done it, and then they screw up. And I remember a client of mine, this was back in 2010 when I first wrote my 2000 Windows Server 2008 running SQL Server 2008 failover cluster series. And he was following the documentation, and he said, how come I could not failover? And he realized that he only built a single node cluster because Windows allows you to do that. And again, it is not enough for you to just know. Because even when you're following Microsoft documentation, the official documentation, it's confusing. Very confusing. So it is not enough for you to just follow the documentation, watch a YouTube video that walks you through it. There are so many things that go in there that you need guidance, clear guidance. And I wish I've learned this earlier in my career, that I don't have to do it on my own. It is important that somebody guides you through it in the beginning, walking you step by step, and do it until you start building confidence so that you know what you need to do first. Okay. In fact, again, that's kind of like my my answer to that question. Get training. Get training. Don't do this alone. Most people make that mistake of, yeah, I can do this alone. Watch a ton of YouTube videos. Watch a ton of Pluralsight courses. Read articles on MS SQL tips on Udemy, and I can figure this out. And then 4 years later, they're still trying to figure out how to do it. Don't waste your time doing this on your own if you can do it quick and fast with right guidance and not have to scramble around trying to figure things, because it's that in itself is a ton of work. Grabbing this information from here and grabbing this information from here and then figuring out, is this going to work? I don't know. This guy says it will. That guy said it will. And you try it out, like, nope. Okay. Save yourself some time, save yourself some resources, get an expert involved, and go get training. That's my answer to that question. Anyway, this is about it for today's, and I know I took a ton of time answering each question except for the last one, because it really is important when you're doing an upgrade and a migration project. I did say it's a project. There are things that you have to consider. There are things that you need to plan for. And the most important thing is to mitigate risks, especially if this is already in production. Mitigate risks. And you don't want to be shooting yourself in the dark thinking, oh, I've already covered everything. If this is the first time you're doing it, I can guarantee you have not covered everything. Even if you thought, because again, your perspective is limited based on the environment you are working on and you're exposed to, unless you've already seen so many of these challenges. It is kind of like shooting in the dark and not knowing what to do next. And that's what I'm here for. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's have that talk. If you need help with anything SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery, whether it's deploying always on availability groups or doing a migration or an upgrade, schedule a call. I'm more than happy to help you come up with a strategy that is specifically for you. Every environment is different, every case is different. You don't want to be following guidance for something that does not work for you. It's one of the reasons I tell my customers I don't really follow best practices, because the vendor who came up with best practices have all the resources, all the money, all the engineering talent and skills. You don't. Come up with your own best practice. You can use that as a guideline, but come up with your own. Okay. Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a call, and let's have that talk. And I'll be happy to help you in any way I can. And if not, I'm going to steer you in the right direction where it would serve you the most. And like I said, if you need any help, use that link on the screen, schedule a call, and let's have that talk. All right. That's about it for this week's topic: patching and rather not patching, migrating and or upgrading SQL Server high availability solutions. Tune in again and next week for another episode of our Practical SQL Server HADR show. Until next week. And if you have follow-up questions, use the link to the forum below. Submit your questions way ahead of time so that I can add them on the banner. It's fancy when people get to read the banners and they can read and understand the question. Tune in again next Friday for another topic, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. I can say weekend because it's Friday, and I will go ahead and shovel my driveway. Have an amazing weekend.